I was hoping to finish Ruth before the end of the fall semester, but it didn't work out that way. I think when I write my autobiography, I'm going to title it, "But It Just Didn't Work Out That Way." So we're going to take a look at Ruth 4 today, and we'll see how far we get. And I have a concluding reflection on Ruth, and then we'll take up 1 Samuel. So remember, just by way of refreshing memories, we have a brief story here in the book of Ruth about basically 5 characters. The story begins with a woman by the name of Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons. There's a famine in the land of Israel. They're forced to go to the land of Moab, where the 2 sons marry Moabite women. And then in short order, disaster hits. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and then her 2 sons die. So now we've gone from a cast of 3 married couples to a cast of 3 widows. And once again, we want to remember, right? These are some of the most vulnerable people in the ancient world. Widows, orphans, sojourners, they're the most vulnerable people in the ancient world because they literally have no one to protect them. And so Naomi decides to go back to Israel. She hears word that the famine's over. She can go back, so she decides to go back, and she tells her 2 daughters-in-law that they just need to stay here in Moab because they don't need to uproot their lives and move to a foreign country where there's probably going to be some hostility towards them because they're foreigners. And that's when Ruth says, no. Wherever you go, I'll go. Your God will be my God. I don't really care what it's going to cost me to go with you. I'm not leaving you alone. And so Ruth goes with Naomi back to the land of Israel. And then we get the adventure of, okay, well, how are they going to survive? Right? Once again, this is the ancient world. They can't just get jobs at McDonald's or apply for Social Security or something like that, because none of those things exist. And so what happens, right, initially, remember, Ruth begins gleaning in the field of a relative of Naomi's whose name is Boaz. And what Boaz does is he allows Naomi actually to glean well beyond what the law of Moses requires. So in effect, right, while she's gleaning, quote unquote, he basically allows her to get enough grain for like half a year's food. It's hugely generous. And so this then creates the desire in Naomi's mind of calling upon Boaz to be the redeemer, a really important concept. So here's the idea. Apparently, and we don't actually find this out until chapter 4, apparently what's happened is that Naomi, in order to survive, has had to mortgage her family land. And we just remember, right, this is a traditional society. Family land is inalienable. Right? Think, aristocrats in England who have held the same land for like centuries. Okay? I was reading about one family, it's the Duke of Rutland. They've had the land that they've been living in now since the Norman conquest. So this is not a culture where you just sort of buy, this is not a culture where you're going to have, like people out there like flipping houses. Okay? So the idea here is someone's going to have to redeem this land so that Naomi and Ruth can live on it. Who's that going to be? They have to find a redeemer, and of course, one of the things that the law of Moses requires, right, is if you fall into debt, right, the next nearest family member has the obligation to be your redeemer. The one who's going to buy you out of debt, out of difficulty, out of impoverishment. Theological footnote, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, God identifies to Moses that he's going to redeem the people of Israel out of slavery. So this word redeemer is really important. I'll say some more about it. And so Boaz actually agrees to do this. And this is what he says to Ruth. Ruth in effect has come to him, offered him the idea of him being the Redeemer and also of marrying Ruth, thus giving her status. And this is what Boaz, in part, says to her in Ruth 3:11. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. So what happens here is Boaz says, okay, I'm not only willing to redeem the land that you sold mortgaged, I'm also willing to marry you and to have children by you so that Naomi's name can be, and Elimelech's name can be perpetuated. This is what was called in the book of Leviticus the law of levirate marriage. That is, we just want to notice here, right? We want to notice the burden and the weight that Boaz is willing to take on, right? I'm willing to buy your family property out of debt, which, who knows how much that's going to cost. And I'm willing to marry you on the understanding that any children I have by you are not going to be mine. They're going to be for your husband that died previously. So Boaz here is like taking on like a lot. He's already allowed Ruth and Naomi to glean way, 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 way beyond what the law requires. So really important picture here. Boaz is an icon of generosity. He's also an icon of what I've been calling hesed. So remember, I think on our first session, I said that I wouldn't translate the word because A, the Hebrew word hesed actually has no real good English equivalent, and B, the problem with the English word love is it's been so sentimentalized. So here, right, the Hebrew word hesed, which as I'll explain in a minute, comes to be the sort of fundamental word for describing the love of God. Hesed here means something like covenant-loving faithfulness. Okay? Hesed does not mean warm emotions. Hesed means that you are willing to recognize your obligation to someone else and to do something for them that will probably be difficult and costly for you. So obviously, right, chapter 3 would be very different if, Ruth comes to Boaz and say, hey, Boaz, we need you to be the redeemer here. And Boaz says, you know what, Ruth? Every time I see you, my heart skips a beat. And I just have like really warm emotions for you and for Naomi. And I'm going to send you Valentine's Day cards. But I'm not lifting a finger to help you. You can't do that with the word hesed, right? Hesed means you're either doing something for someone that's costly or you're not doing it. It's either there or it's not. Okay, just like you can't be, somewhat married or somewhat pregnant. You can't have a little bit dash of hesed. Okay, it just doesn't work that way. So Boaz here becomes a kind of an icon of what hesed looks like. It means doing something for someone else that is going to be costly and difficult for you, but is going to be of benefit to them. So that's what Boaz does. And so in chapter 4, we have the resolution of the story, and here's what happens. In 4:1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. So in this culture, right, all justice is carried out at the city gate. If you want to think of it this way, the city gate is the county courthouse. Okay, this is where trials take place. This is where all legal transactions takes place. That's what's going on here. So that's what Boaz does. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside. Here's an interesting point here in 4:1. Boaz says, turn aside, friend. Sit down here. In the original Hebrew, the word here isn't friend at all. This is something that the ESV has done to make it comprehensible. Literally in the Hebrew, Boaz says, turn aside so-and-so and sit down. Now, the reason why I'm calling attention to this is, notice here, we're not given this man's name. He's not named. And, there are probably some reasons for that. One reason is that he is, to use the technical theological term, a schmuck. He turns down his obligation to be the Redeemer, although he's the closest one. And so, in effect, his name gets deleted out of the story. So he's now known as, Mr. Schmuck in the story. He turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Mr. Schmuck, "Naomi has come back from the country of Moab and is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you, Mr. Schmuck." And Mr. Schmuck says, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz adds the next little thing that's part of this bargain. Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." That is, Mr. Schmuck says, "No, thank you. That sounds like too much. I am not going to live into my obligation, because what you're talking about just sounds like way, 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 way beyond what I'm willing to do." And therefore Boaz steps in. And this helps us, right, understand Boaz's generosity, right? We've discovered that probably like a younger man has thought this whole package like too much. Even though, right, Boaz has made sure that what's going on here is public. That is, you've got these 10 elders of the city there. They're at the city gate in the county courthouse. That is, this is an official proceeding. And so Boaz wants to make sure, okay, look, before I do anything, I want to make sure that you are being publicly offered the role that really is on your shoulders. And if you're not going to live into it, you need to stand up publicly and say, "No, I'm a schmuck. I'm not living into my obligation." There's something to be said for this, right? There's no, lines of lawyers writing subtle documents about, the party, the first part, and the party, the second part, and, kind of allows everything to be sort of like obscured. This is like, are you willing to do this? Yes or no? And say so publicly. So, really important. If he redeemed it, yes. Yeah, it would have. Yeah, it's clear that the line of descent now is going to come through Ruth because she's come back. Had she not come back, that would have changed the narrative pretty dramatically. Yeah. And once again, right, we're talking about a traditional culture, right, where continuous possession of land and continuous biological inheritance is very, very important. This will explain later on, by the way, why when we get to 1 Samuel, why Hannah's childlessness is such a horrible thing. Okay, it's like one of the worst fates imaginable. Okay, well, I'll say more about that when we take a look at 1 Samuel. So Boaz is willing to live into his obligations, and this is what he says in 4:9. Then Boaz said to the elders of the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have brought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead. To perpetuate the name of the dead, not to perpetuate my name, but to perpetuate the name of her former husband. So once again, there's that. That the name of the dead may not be cut off from his brothers and from the gate of his native place. And so this is accepted, and they move on with this. And then Ruth and Boaz get married. And this is what happens in 4:13, really important. And then there's one final note that I want to draw your attention to. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer." There's that word again. "And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." And of course, then we find out, as we discover at the end there, they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So the son here that Ruth bears is the grandfather of David. And that's sort of like our lead-in now to the next phase of Old Testament history. Now, just a couple things here that I think we want to notice. It really is important, right, to notice here that what happens at the end is something of an answer to a complaint that Naomi lodges against God in the beginning of the book. Remember, she says in 1:20, she says to the people when she comes back to Israel, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Mara in Hebrew means bitter. Little footnote, right? Anyone who you encounter whose name is Mara, right, you probably want to avoid because they're bitter. But just notice what happens here. Naomi says at the beginning of the story, in effect, God has abandoned me. He's left me alone. And at the end of the story, right, we find out something that's really important. No, he is not. Why? Well, a number of reasons why, but one reason why is Ruth, the Moabite, the Gentile, who is worth more than, did you get it? 7 sons. Now, I think, the Old Testament can be read at a number of levels, and that's one of the important things about it, right? I'm going to say a few things about that in just a minute. But one of the things that's certainly being said here, right, is we can imagine or think about an Israel in exile, here the Babylonian exile, right? Jerusalem destroyed, people of Israel all exiled to various points in modern-day Iraq and parts of the Babylonian Empire. We can imagine Israel saying to God, "You have abandoned us. You've left us all alone. You broke your promises. What's wrong?" And we can imagine, right, them reading this story and being brought to a realization, well, no, we haven't been abandoned. It just looks that way at this moment, but we haven't been abandoned, okay? A similar moment, of course, is going to occur on Good Friday, where it will appear that Jesus, too, has been abandoned, but of course, he's not. So that's a really important theological note. Yeah?
Rashi says that charity in Hebrew means justice.
Mm-hmm.
So when you back to that end, what Ruth is saying, she said, "Well, God, you're not just." But then the good comes out of it. So actually, he is just because Boaz proves that he is just through Boaz.
Yes.
It's interesting that justice and good deeds go together.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what my point about Hesed, right? Yeah. Is that Hesed is something that's lived out. And I think Jan's point is really important. And that is that one of the things that we're getting at here is that in this story, there are 3 practitioners of Hesed. And we want to kind of note all of them. Because I think noticing this is important for thinking about the meaning of Ruth. So, right, practitioner of Hesed number one, of course, is Ruth herself. She practices loyalty and faithfulness to Naomi, who can literally do nothing for her, right? Naomi really has nothing to offer Ruth. As a matter of fact, and by leaving Moab and going back to Israel with her, she not only has nothing to offer except maybe like trouble and potential rejection and persecution and a bunch of other negative things. So here's one thing about Hesed, right? One dimension of Hesed is it means that you are doing something for someone who can be of no benefit to you. And I think that's an important insight in Hesed, right? One aspect of the Hesed that God practices, right, is God can literally not benefit from you and I, right? One of the things about God being the creator is God actually has nothing to gain from us. And therefore, right, the love that God practices toward us is always completely asymmetrical. In terms of what God does, right, God's always on the giving end, never on the receiving. Because being God, right, he needs nothing. And so therefore, right, what we're getting in the picture of Ruth, right, is we're getting an insight into what Hesed looks like, at least from God's side, insofar as we can get that, right?
Judaism wants people to partner with God.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like he doesn't need us, but he wants us.
Yeah, there's a purpose, but not a need. Yeah, so God doesn't need his covenant people. As a matter of fact, his relationship with them actually emphasizes his lovingness because he chooses to work through them, although he has no need of them. And they simply cause trouble. Yes, the covenant is never mutual. Covenant is never mutual here, either in the Old Testament or in the New. It's never a sort of, you scratch your back, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours sort of deal. Yeah, we don't really know. Yeah, the story doesn't really tell us enough to answer that question. I think we can gather, right, from what we know about his character, he would certainly have been open to doing it, and that's part of the story. Yeah. Oh, the question was, do we have any reason to think that Boaz might have done this before? And I just said the story doesn't really tell us enough. Yeah, I think the idea right here is that, and this goes back to Jan's point, right? Another point that's operative here in Ruth is, and this would be my second point, right? On one hand, right, we have the Hesed of God, but we also have the idea, right, that God's Hesed is also practiced through people. And this is like a really, really important moral point. We can't get to it today, unfortunately, because we're almost out of time, but this is what I'll start with next time. That is, as we think about Ruth, I think one of the things that we want to think about is we want to think about the moral dimension of Ruth. That is, it's not just like a neat story, where they all live happily ever after, and it could be made into like a Hallmark movie or something like that. No slight on Hallmark movies. I think one of the things that we're getting at here, though, is we're getting a really important sort of moral point that's going to be carried over into the New Testament. And it's this. What is it that God wants for his people? Once again, not that he needs it. What is it God wants from his people? What's like the whole purpose of this whole covenant thing? What's it all about? And of course, you may remember, right? Jesus was in effect asked that very same question by someone who's an expert in the law, right? What's the greatest commandment? In effect, Jesus asked the question, okay, look, what is this whole covenant thing about? Tell me. And of course, you get the idea, right, that the asker actually wants the answer involving the least demand possible. Right? That's what he wants. And so Jesus doesn't give it to him. And so remember what Jesus does? Well, what is this whole covenant thing about? Well, that's easy. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, Deuteronomy 6. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself, Leviticus 19.
He also said the Shema too. One of the Gospels, he said the Shema, hear, O Israel. At least the way it's translated, it's cold. It says, hear, O Israel. So that's part of it.
That's the reference to Deuteronomy 6. Yes.
But he says that when they ask what's the most important commandment, he includes that.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't include that part. That actually Paul mentions that in 1 Corinthians 8. That's where actually Paul quotes the Shema from Deuteronomy 6.
In the Gospel, it has colon, as if it is part of that answer. So they translated it wrong or put colon in the wrong place or what?
I think the way that Jesus says it, he's simply sort of leaving it understood that that's what's being said, although it's not being said in its totality. Yeah. So the other thing that one of the really important moral points here, right, is what is the purpose of all this covenant stuff? It's to create the kind of people who are capable of being instruments of God's hesed. That's like the whole project is about, right? That's what's going on here. That's one of the really fundamental things that Ruth is getting at. That is, yes, God's a practitioner of hesed, but of course so is Ruth. And so is Boaz, and that's the point. And of course, right, we're being led to sort of think about things in one of the nice things about stories, right, is they invite us to think beyond concepts. That is, let's think for a minute, right? What would this situation have looked like if both Ruth and Boaz were not practitioners of hesed? What if they all said, yeah, going back to Israel with my former mother-in-law, too much, not interested, so long. And if Boaz said, yeah, Redeemer, that sounds like a whole lot of work. No, thank you. It would have been a very different world. And so what we're being told here, right, is that at the heart and center of the morality of the Old Testament, right, is this idea that God's at work creating a kind of people who are instruments of his own hesed, his own covenant-loving faithfulness. And that's why, and this is where we'll stop, it's really important, right, when Jesus gives the new commandment in John 13, right? The new commandment is what? Love one another as I have loved you. As I have loved you. There's nothing sentimental about that, right? Jesus isn't saying, well, I'm going to, on Good Friday, I'm going to be standing like 4 miles from the site of the crucifixion place, and I'm going to be having warm feelings about each one of you. It's going to be really neat. and then I'm going to send you, a lifetime supply of Hallmark cards. No. As I have loved you, right, requires self-sacrifice, doing something beneficial to someone that will not benefit you at all. So we'll take up this theme. I'll finish this theme next Sunday, and then we'll start 1 Samuel. Oh,